The lasagna steam curled into the kitchen light, and my mother's fork made a neat, bright sound against the plate. My father didn't look up when I said it. The words came out small and dry like paper. USC said no. He speared another bite, asked, "So that's all of them?" Then I nodded, and the porch light outside clicked on with the automatic timer casting a dull oval on the rain-spotted glass. "Well," my mother said, settling her napkin like a verdict, "we always knew you weren't academically inclined like your sister." Across the table, a stack of glossy programs from Audrey's latest awards dinner leaned against the salt shaker, their gold letters winking under the dome light, as if the house itself agreed. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever been treated like you didn't matter, hit that like button and share this with someone who'll understand. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. But to understand how that dinner hardened into something I'd carry for years, you need to know where it began. I grew up in a 2-story house north of Seattle, the kind with damp porch steps that grew moss every winter. My mother kept the entry neat with a ceramic bowl for keys and a mirror that caught you from the shoulders up. On the wall opposite frames marched in perfect rows Audrey's spelling bee photos, Audrey's science fair medals, Audrey shaking hands with a dean whose name I never learned. My own certificates lived in a drawer next to the batteries and takeout menus. If I held them up, my mother would smile the way people smile at a neighbor's new mailbox, polite, not impressed. I wasn't jealous the way children are jealous. It was quieter than that. I learned to take up less space. I learned to keep my voice even and my hands folded. When Dad bragged about Audrey's percentile scores over barbecue smoke in the backyard, chest puffed like the lid of the grill, I stood with the cooler and kept the cups stacked. When the conversation turned my way, he patted my shoulder and said, "Bee's doing fine," as if fine were a fence to keep me from wandering. Then sophomore year, a schedule change dropped me into Intro to Computer Science. Mr. Hoffman wore coffee on his tie and wrote curly braces like someone carving initials into a tree. The first time the code ran and the screen obeyed, something practical and beautiful opened in me. The logic was clean. The possibilities were endless. I stayed after school because the whir of the lab consoles felt like a language I had always known, but never heard aloud. I built a simple app to help classmates track assignments, and when it worked, Mr. Hoffman tapped the paper with his pen and said in a voice that didn't need an audience, "You have a gift for this, Beatrice." That night I told my parents at the oak table while my mother tossed salad with patient wrists. "It's not playing," I said, because she'd already called it that. "I built an application from scratch." She didn't look up. "Colleges want well-rounded students," she said, eyes on the cucumbers. "Don't be one of those tech kids who forget the real world." My father wiped his mouth and said, "Did you hear Audrey got the research assistantship? Her professor says she might co-author as an undergrad." He asked questions that filled the room, and the salad tongs clicked like a metronome while my news cooled on the plate. I learned to fold my pride into quiet places. I kept building. I joined the computer club and won a regional coding competition no one attended on my behalf. I wrote essays that sounded like me and applications that were meticulous as stitched seams. I ran my fingers across the thick envelopes in the college counselor's sample stack and tried to imagine what my name would look like on them. Mr. Hoffman read my personal statement twice and said, "USC's program will understand you." I walked home on a night that smelled like wet cedar and thought for the first time that a door might open for me. March came in cold and tidy. The mailbox on our street tilted a little, and I checked it the way a hungry person checks the clock, too often, too hopeful. When the first letter arrived, the paper inside had that soft ink smell of a printer that runs too hot. "We regret to inform you." It was from a safety school, and I spent a long time pressing the crease flat with my thumb. More envelopes came, a line of pale birds roosting on my desk. "We regret. Wait list. Thank you for your interest." Each one made the house feel a notch colder. My parents said the kinds of things people say when they want their indifference to sound sensible. College isn't for everyone. Not everyone needs a fancy degree. My mother set a stack of coupons by my plate and said, "Don't forget, the community college offers good certificates." I still had one hope left. USC. I knew the envelope that came wasn't thick. I knew what thin meant. I took it upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed where the afternoon rain stitched light into the window. I didn't want them to see the moment I became small. The letter was short, standard, unremarkable 5 lines that would keep me out of conversations for the rest of my senior year. I folded it carefully and waited for dinner the way you wait to apologize for something that isn't your fault. At the table, my father asked that question without looking up, and my mother gave her ruling. "You're not academically inclined like your sister." I tried to speak. "I have a 4.0. It sounded weak, even to me, the way light sounds weak through heavy rain. "I won the regional coding competition." She buttered bread, not unkindly, not kindly either, and said the line I would hear again and again. "Those computer things are just hobbies, B." When graduation came, my classmates wore sweatshirts from places whose names can fill a room. They barked laughter into the June air and took pictures under a maple tree whose roots had buckled the sidewalk since before any of us were born. When someone asked where I was going, I smiled in the polite way I'd learned and said, "Taking some time to figure things out." People's mouths made a sympathy shape. Mr. Hoffman stopped me by the gym doors with light pooled in the floor from the tall glass blocks. "I don't understand," he said, frowning at a world that didn't make sense. "With your portfolio, you should have multiple offers." I nodded because there was nothing else to do. I held my program until my palms left damp ovals on the paper. Summer had a sound in our neighborhood sprinklers, ticking someone's radio low, the cough of an old lawnmower starting. Audrey flew back in a white dress for parties that smelled like frosting and eucalyptus candles. "Johns Hopkins," my mother said to the same aunt twice in the same afternoon, as if repeating it could set the words in porcelain. I stayed upstairs most days, with the fan pointed at my ankles and the laptop shut, because even the sound of it waking felt like a dare I wasn't allowed to take. The house kept its routines. The porch light still clicked on at 8. The dishwasher still hummed at 9. Somewhere between my parents enrolled me in 3 classes at the community college 5 miles away. Basic English, Introductory Algebra, a computer class, since you seem to like that. The paper with the schedule lay on the counter under a magnet shaped like a crab from a trip I hadn't been invited on. "Nothing too challenging," my mother said, smiling in a way that told me she believed she was being merciful. The words were gentle, and the decision was not. I stared at the ink until the lines blurred, and in the reflection on the microwave door, I could see myself the way they saw me. Presentable, agreeable, uncomplicated. I went through the motions like it was a job someone else had chosen for me. I drove my mother's old Civic that smelled faintly of gum and glass cleaner. I learned the parking lot at the community college where the strip of blackberry vines behind the far row snagged the cuffs of your jeans if you weren't careful. The campus had square buildings and long hallways that moved air like a tunnel. My assigned computer class covered material I had already taught myself from tired textbooks with the corners softened by other hands. The instructor spoke earnestly about loops and conditionals while I watched the cursor blink on an empty screen the way a small animal watches a door. When I told my parents the class was too basic, my father said something about foundations, and my mother suggested joining a club to round out my profile. I wanted to tell them there was nothing round about being flatly unseen. Instead, I said, "Okay," and cleared the table, the dishwater going gray with the residue of a dinner I didn't taste. At night, I lay in a room that had once held collages and pep rally posters, and I stared at faint thumbtack marks in the drywall like constellations that no longer meant anything. I still coded sometimes late when the house was asleep and the porch light faced its empty street. The keys sounded too loud in the quiet, so I slowed my hands and waited between lines. I wasn't supposed to be a person who wanted more. I had learned that. I had learned it at the oak table in the car rides, where praise moved like weather around me, in the small ways a family trains a child to read a room and step back from the light. Still the code ran when I asked it to faithful as a dog sitting on command. It told me that logic could be clean even if people weren't. One evening in August, the sky held that particular Pacific Northwest blue that only shows up after rain. Mr. Hoffman's email sat unread for a day because I didn't want Hope to look at me and then leave. When I opened it, his message was practical and kind. He asked for a copy of the app I'd written and said a former student of his worked with gifted coders and might have ideas. I closed the laptop slowly, palms damp, as if the future could scatter if I moved too fast. Downstairs, my mother called my name to help with groceries. I went because that's what I did, because habit can be a kind of shelter when your life feels spare. We ate roasted chicken that night, and the bone pile grew on my father's plate while he talked about mortgage rates with a neighbor over the phone. My mother set a single lemon wedge in front of me and said, "Squeeze it over the spinach, dear. It'll brighten it up." I did as I was told. The house was as it had always been, tidy, the rug straight, the air smelling faintly of lemon and the damp that never fully leaves. The porch light clicked on at 8, exactly washing the driveway in pale gold. I went to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the computer I had closed. The fan in the ceiling creaked softly in its orbit. In the quiet, I heard the smallest sound paper settling in the desk drawer, where I'd tucked those thin envelopes. I knew each one by weight, and Fold could have picked them out of a box blindfolded. I reached for the drawer, then stopped my hand, hovering just above the pull. There are moments when a person decides between staying asleep and waking up. They don't announce themselves. They don't come with music. They arrive as a breath held a second too long, as a space between heartbeat and step. I turned off the lamp, let the room go dark, and sat in that space until my eyes made out the silver edge of the window lock against the streetlight glow. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and fell silent. I lay back the mattress, familiar to my shoulders, and stared at the ceiling seam that had always run a little crooked. I didn't know it yet, but something in me had shifted. A door I couldn't see had eased on its hinges. And in the morning, when the house hummed awake and the porch light clicked off like a blessing withdrawn, I would feel the first faint pull of that hinge, quiet, undeniable, as the rest of the world went on believing I was exactly who they had said I was. The morning after that quiet shift in me, the air felt heavier than usual, as if the clouds had settled closer to the ground. I drove to class through a drizzle that left faint lines on the windshield, each one splitting and joining like small decisions. The parking lot at the community college gleamed with puddles, and the buildings loomed pale against the gray sky. I went through the motions class cafeteria, coffee, polite small talk. But somewhere underneath, something had begun to hum. I didn't recognize it then, as hope only that it refused to be quiet. By the second week, my programming professor started watching me differently. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a voice that carried even in small rooms. When class ended one afternoon, he waited by the desk, the hum of computers filling the silence. "Miss Walsh," he said gently, "you finish every assignment before most students open the file." I smiled a little, unsure if it was a compliment or a reprimand. He motioned toward my screen. "You've already added functions we don't even teach here." Where did you learn that I told him about the years I'd spent alone in the high school computer lab, the programs that never saw daylight, the app that helped classmates stay organized? He studied me for a moment, then said, "You don't belong in this class. Honestly, You don't belong in this college. I didn't know how to answer that. For a second, shame flared as though being there was proof of my limits, but his expression wasn't mocking. It was thoughtful, protective, almost. Have you heard of Innovate Boot Camp in San Francisco? He asked. When I shook my head, he described it 6 months of intensive coding real-world projects, direct links to major tech companies. They take the best and push them harder, he said. You'd fit. I laughed softly, not from disbelief, but self-defense. It sounds expensive. They offer scholarships, he said. Applications close in November. If you're serious, I'll write your recommendation myself. That night, I sat on my bed, laptop open, reading everything I could about the program. Photos of open workspaces filled with tired, determined faces. Testimonials from graduates who now worked at companies I'd only read about. Each line of text felt like a door cracking open. I didn't tell my parents right away. I wanted the idea to be mine for a while, untouched by their doubt. In October, I started the application quietly. Professor Davis kept his word, writing a letter that made me tear up when he handed me a copy. For your records, he said, smiling. And for the days you forget who you are. I submitted everything on the last possible night, the glow of the monitor, the only light in the room. Then I waited. The acceptance email arrived in mid-December. I was sitting at the kitchen table paying bills for my mother as she talked about Audrey's new apartment near the hospital. When my phone buzzed, I opened it without thinking, and the first word I saw was congratulations. I read it 3 times to be sure. 70% of tuition covered. A seat reserved for January. I felt my heart race so hard, I thought she might hear it. Mom, I said, finally, my voice trembling. I got in. She looked up from the grocery list. We're into Innovate Boot Camp. It's a coding program in San Francisco. They offered me a scholarship. She blinked, confused, then dismissive. A camp for computers. It's not a camp. It's one of the best programs in the country. Graduates get jobs at Google and Apple. My father, reading the paper, didn't look up. Sounds like a scam. Those places prey on kids who can't get into real colleges. It's not a scam, I said, holding out my phone for them to see. Professor Davis recommended me. My mother sighed. Playing with computers isn't a real career. Not like medicine. The room felt suddenly too small. Tech is one of the fastest growing industries, I said, trying to keep my voice even. This could be the start of something real for me. We're not paying for it, my father said flatly. If you want to keep living here, you'll stay in community college. Something inside me steadied. I'm going, I said quietly. With or without your help. He set his paper down at last. If you walk out, don't expect us to bail you out when it fails. I won't. They didn't speak to me for the rest of the night. In the weeks before I left, the house went cold. My parents didn't offer to help me pack, didn't ask about logistics. Audrey called during winter break, and they didn't even mention my plans. On a pale January morning, I rolled 2 suitcases to the curb and waited for the car I'd ordered. My mother stood in the doorway with her arms folded under her robe. Good luck, Bea, she said finally, as if I were leaving for summer camp. My father only nodded from the hallway. I climbed into the back seat and didn't look back. The clouds over Seattle hung low, silver and endless. But when the plane lifted through them, sunlight poured over the wings like water. By the time we landed in San Francisco, my fear had changed shape, no longer about failure, but about what freedom might actually feel like. The city smelled of ocean and exhaust. I shared a shuttle with strangers, each of us chasing something new. The apartment I'd found was small, a narrow space shared with 3 other students from the boot camp. The walls were thin, the kitchen tile cracked, but the air felt alive. That night, lying on an unfamiliar mattress, I stared at the ceiling fan, and thought, I'm finally on my own terms. The next morning, I walked to the boot camp building, a renovated warehouse with big windows and exposed beams. Inside, people typed fast, argued over syntax, and laughed the way only tired people laugh. A woman holding a coffee cup spotted me lingering at the entrance. First day, she asked. Her tone was kind, teasing. Is it that obvious? Only because you've been standing there for 5 minutes? She said, grinning. I'm Danny, teaching assistant for back-end development. I liked her instantly. She had a grounded confidence that made the chaos feel manageable. Come on, she said, motioning me forward. Let's get you started before you change your mind. The first weeks were a blur. 12-hour days, dense lessons, endless debugging sessions. I worked part-time at a cafe on weekends to afford rent. Sleep became a rumor. Some nights I fell asleep at my keyboard forehead against the keys. Yet I'd never felt more alive. The people around me spoke my language: logic, creativity, precision. When I solved a problem that had stumped 3 classmates, our instructor Raj called me to the front. This, he said, pointing to my code, is elegant. Remember that word. It's what separates good developers from great ones. For the first time, someone used the word great in a sentence that belonged to me. Money stayed tight. My roommates and I took turns cooking stretching pasta and rice across days. We taped a note on the fridge that read, "Eat, hope not out." It made us laugh when we were too tired to cry. Still, every morning when I walked to class through the cool fog, I felt a strange peace, like I had finally stepped into the life I was supposed to live. 3 months in, we had our first major project: create a working application from scratch. I built a platform to help small businesses predict inventory needs using patterns in their sales data. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. When I presented it, the room went silent, then erupted into applause. Raj leaned over my shoulder, scrolling through the code. This could be marketable, he said quietly. Keep building. After that, I barely noticed the days passing. Recruiters started visiting the program, sleek people in polished shoes asking clever questions. My classmates whispered about offers, interviews, cities. I kept my focus, refining my project. One afternoon, a woman from a data analytics firm stopped at my table. We've been trying to build something like this, she said. Would you be open to an interview? I nodded, unable to trust my voice. 2 weeks later, I had 3 offers. I accepted the one that felt most right: data flow analytics, $95,000, a year, full benefits. When I called my parents, the silence on the other end was louder than I expected. 95,000, my father repeated. That can't be right. They don't pay that kind of money to people without degrees. They're hiring based on skill, I said. I built something they can use. He cleared his throat. Well, that's fine until you decide to get a real career. I ended the call gently, but the old ache didn't land this time. The need for approval had finally loosened its grip. I moved into a small studio apartment with peeling paint and a single window facing a brick wall. It was mine. I hung a whiteboard beside the desk and wrote the words that had carried me here. You belong where you build yourself. 18 months later, I was a senior developer leading a small team. I still sent the occasional message home, short and polite. Most went unanswered. When I visited Seattle for Audrey's medical school graduation, the house looked smaller. My mother's smile was strained, my father grayer. The walls still displayed Audrey's framed achievements, now joined by her white coat photo. During dinner, relatives asked polite questions about my job. My uncle squinted and said, "So you fix computers?" Before I could respond, my mother answered for me. Bee's doing some kind of computer work in California until she figures out her real career. The laughter that followed was soft, harmless to them. To me, it was a closing door. That night, lying in my childhood bed, I overheard my parents speaking to my grandmother in the kitchen. "Of course, we're proud of both girls," my mother said. "But Audrey is saving lives. That's a calling. She's still finding her way." The words should have hurt, but instead, they clarified something. I didn't need to be found by them anymore. I had already found myself. When I returned to San Francisco, I handed in my resignation at Dataflow 2 weeks later. I'd been building an improved version of my old project in my spare hours, refining it into something ready for market. I had savings contacts and a quiet certainty I hadn't felt before. The morning I signed the paperwork to found Next Level Inventory Solutions, the city outside my window was still wrapped in fog. I stood there for a long time, coffee cooling in my hand, listening to the hum of early traffic. Somewhere in that sound was the proof of how far I'd come, not from rebellion, but from believing I could. I didn't know it yet, but the past I'd left buried would soon come knocking, carrying a box that would change everything. 2 years passed in a rhythm that felt both fast and quiet. The company grew from a dream scribbled on whiteboards to a living, breathing thing with clients, employees, and purpose. My days were long, but they felt mine. I rented a small office on Market Street with creaky floors and tall windows that looked out over the fog. At night, when the city lights blurred against the glass, I'd sometimes stay late just to listen to the hum of servers in the next room. It was the sound of something becoming real. When investors finally came knocking, I didn't celebrate right away. Success had always been a careful thing in my life, best handled gently, like glass that could still crack. We closed our first round of funding at $8 million. The ink on the contract had barely dried when I allowed myself one small luxury, a loft in the Mission District, with brick walls, high ceilings, and sunlight that poured in like forgiveness. It was while unpacking that loft between bubble wrap and half-empty boxes that the past came looking for me. I had called my parents a week earlier asking if they could ship some of my old belongings. "We're cleaning out your room anyway," my mother said briskly. "Audrey might need the space for a while." Her tone was practical, but I could hear the faint satisfaction behind it, like rearranging furniture in a room you'd long stopped caring about. The box arrived on a Tuesday. It was larger than I expected, sealed with 2 layers of tape, as if they wanted to make sure nothing escaped. I set it on the kitchen floor and opened it with a small knife, expecting the usual school trophies, yearbooks, maybe a forgotten sweater or two. Inside were fragments of a girl I hardly remembered, old science fair ribbons, a faded middle school t-shirt, notebooks filled with early code written in shaky loops. I smiled at one of the pages, my first attempt at a program that never ran right. Beneath those wrapped in yellowed paper sat an envelope thick with age. It was addressed to me. University of Southern California. Office of Admissions. For a second, I couldn't move. The seal was still intact, the edges softened by time. My fingers felt clumsy as I tore it open. The paper inside unfolded like it had been waiting. "Dear Miss Walsh," it began, "it is with great pleasure that we offer you admission to the University of Southern California's class of 2011. Furthermore, based on your exceptional academic record and coding portfolio, we are pleased to offer you the President's Scholarship covering full tuition, room, and board." The words blurred. I read them again, slower this time, until the weight of them settled in my chest. 10 years ago, I had believed I wasn't good enough for a single college. I had lived, studied, and worked under that shadow. Now the truth sat open in my hands, like proof that the girl they had called average was never the problem. My breath came unevenly. I searched the box again, papers spilling across the hardwood. More envelopes surfaced their corners, softened each one unopened. I ripped them open one by one, 6 other schools, 6 other acceptances. Some offered partial scholarships. Others wrote of promise and potential. My knees gave out before the last letter hit the floor. I sat surrounded by proof of what I'd been denied, a quiet storm building behind my ribs. My hands shook so badly I had to set the letters down before they tore. The apartment was silent except for my own breathing. Outside, someone laughed on the street below, the sound thin and distant. I stared at the pile on the floor, realizing that someone, 2 someones, had hidden all of this. My parents hadn't simply overlooked my achievements, they had stolen them. The next morning, I called USC's admissions office. I half expected the record to be gone, the letter some strange mistake. But the woman who answered was calm and professional. "Yes, Miss Walsh," she said after a few moments. "You were offered the President's Scholarship in 2007. We sent follow-up letters and attempted to reach you by phone. Eventually, your mother called to inform us you'd chosen another institution. It was the confirmation I didn't want, but needed." I thanked her and ended the call, sitting there in the quiet hum of the office. My reflection in the window looked older, sharper. I thought of my mother's voice on the phone the day she'd shipped the box, steady, efficient, without a trace of guilt. That evening, I dialed home. My father answered. His voice carried the same polite distance it always had. "B," he said, surprised but cautious. "I got the box," I said. "There was something in it you forgot to mention." "What's that?" "My USC acceptance letter. The one offering a full scholarship." Silence. I could hear the faint sound of the refrigerator in the background, the clink of a glass being set down. "Dad, did you and Mom hide my college letters from me?" He exhaled slowly. It was a complicated time. He began. "Then make it simple." He hesitated before answering. "Yes, we did. But you have to understand, Audrey had just been accepted to medical school. The costs were enormous. We couldn't afford to support both of you. And what?" My voice trembled, not from fear, but from rage kept too long. He cleared his throat. "It would have crushed her to know you'd been offered a scholarship she hadn't. We made a decision for the family. The family." That old, tired phrase. I heard my mother pick up the other line. Her voice was calm, almost bored. "We did what was best for everyone. Your computer hobby was never a real career, B. Audrey's path required support. Yours didn't." I gripped the phone so tightly it hurt. "You let me believe I wasn't good enough. You watched me fall apart, and you said nothing. You've turned out fine," my father said, as if that erased it. "You didn't need college after all. Look how successful you are." The words hollowed me. "I don't want to hear from either of you again," I said quietly. "Not calls, not emails. Nothing." "B, you're overreacting," my mother began, but I'd already ended the call. I sat in the middle of my living room floor, surrounded by letters that had once carried my future. I thought about that girl, the one who had cried into her pillow, convinced she wasn't worth the ink on a rejection letter. She had believed them every word, every silence. I reached for the nearest letter and smoothed it flat, tears blurring the edges. The following weeks moved like underwater time. I went through work, through meetings, through the noise of success, but part of me was somewhere else, still kneeling on that floor, staring at the truth. It wasn't until my therapist said it out loud that I began to breathe again. "You can't reclaim the years they stole," she said gently. "But you can decide what you'll do with what's left." Her office was quiet, warm, lined with books and framed watercolor prints. Your parents' betrayal doesn't define you, she said. Your response to it will. I nodded, but the words sank slowly. I thought about the years I'd chased approval, every achievement a silent plea to be seen. Maybe this was what freedom looked like, grief that burned clean. I poured myself into work. If I couldn't have the education I'd earned, I would build something even they couldn't ignore. Within a year, Next Level had doubled in size. We moved into a glass building downtown, the company name etched at the entrance. Reporters began calling. Investors smiled wider. I barely slept, but it was the kind of exhaustion that came with purpose. I didn't tell my parents any of it. Their absence was a wound, but also a kind of peace. For the first time, my life felt untouched by their hands. 2 years later, the company was valued at more than $300 million. We had 70 employees, a new round of funding, and a reputation for changing how businesses manage their inventory. I had built a life that was unrecognizable from the one they'd designed for me, a home with sunlight, friends who felt like family, and work that mattered. But sometimes, when the office went quiet at night, I'd look out over the city and think of that girl in Seattle waiting for mail that never came. And I'd wonder how many versions of her were still waiting somewhere, believing they weren't enough. I turned off the lights and gathered my coat. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and new carpet. My assistant had left a stack of folders on my desk. But one envelope caught my eye, a glossy magazine with my face on the cover. Forbes 30. Under 30. I smiled faintly, not out of vanity, but recognition. 10 years ago, my parents had buried a letter that said, I belonged. Now the world had found its own way to tell me. The following week, an email slipped through the company's spam filter. The subject line read, "Congratulations from your sister." For a long time, I stared at it without opening it. Audrey's name glowed in the corner of the screen, steady and familiar. My hands hovered over the keyboard, not ready, but curious. When I finally clicked it open, the first line was simple. I saw your Forbes feature. I always knew you were smart, but I never realized how brilliant you truly are. I miss my sister. I read it twice, then closed the laptop softly. The city outside was dark, the skyline quiet. Somewhere beneath the hum of the streetlights, something old began to stir, part grief, part curiosity, part caution. After all these years, the people who'd buried my future were reaching toward the life I'd built without them. And deep down, I already knew why. The email sat open on my screen, its few sentences glowing against the dim light of my office. Audrey's words were careful, maybe even kind, but every line carried something uncertain underneath. It had been years since I'd heard her voice or seen her handwriting. Now here she was, reaching out through a new address, congratulating me on the same success our parents had once dismissed. I didn't reply right away. I closed the laptop and sat there, listening to the soft hum of the city outside the windows. The sound of cars, distant and steady, reminded me that life had moved forward, mine especially. But curiosity has a way of tugging even at the most guarded heart. 2 days later, I wrote back, keeping it brief. Thank you. I hope you're well. That small exchange opened the door just enough for a slow trickle of emails to follow. At first, Audrey wrote about work, her patience, the exhaustion of residency. She said she'd stayed in Portland after finishing her fellowship and was trying to build her own practice. I kept my answers polite and restrained. It felt strange to talk to someone who had lived so close to the damage yet claimed not to see it. By the 3rd week, the tone of her messages began to shift. She mentioned her debt, the medical school loans, the rising rent, the hospital politics. Her sentences carried a weight that felt familiar. the same subtle pressure our parents used to apply when they wanted something. I read her words carefully, knowing where this might be headed. 3 months later, her concerns turned personal. Dad's heart has been giving him trouble, she wrote. Mom's been quiet about it, but I think things are serious. Insurance isn't covering everything. I stared at that line for a long time. It was the first mention of our parents since the night I told them never to call again. I didn't respond. The next email didn't come from Audrey, it came from my mother. The subject read, "Family Meeting." She wrote as if no time had passed, her tone brisk professional. "Beatrice, I'm sure Audrey has told you about your father's health. We'd like to come to San Francisco next month to discuss some important matters. Please let us know your availability." I sat back in my chair, the air in my office suddenly too still. I hadn't seen them in years. Now they wanted a meeting, and the timing couldn't have been clearer. My Forbes feature had been out for less than 2 months. That night, I told Alex and Danny over dinner. The 3 of us met every Thursday at a small restaurant tucked behind an art gallery. The lights there were always soft, the tables narrow enough that conversations stayed close. "They're going to ask for money," Danny said, immediately breaking a piece of bread. Alex was quieter. "Maybe they also want closure," he said. "Closure," Danny repeated, shaking her head. "People don't fly 2 states for closure. They want something." They were both right in different ways. I didn't know exactly what my parents wanted, but I knew I needed to face them on my terms this time. I agreed to the meeting, choosing the place myself, a restaurant downtown, where the tables gleamed like polished stone, and the service left no room for chaos. I asked Alex to come not at the table, but nearby, a quiet anchor, in case I needed it. The night they arrived, the air carried that soft chill San Francisco gets when fog rolls in early. I came 30 minutes ahead of them and asked for a table near the window where the candlelight could fall between us instead of on me. When they entered, I recognized them by posture before face. My father's careful stride, my mother's straight shoulders, Audrey trailing half a step behind. "B," my mother said, with a brightness that didn't reach her eyes. Her perfume was the same as it had been my whole childhood, faintly floral, with something sharper underneath. My father's face looked thinner, the skin around his mouth pale. Audrey hugged me gently, her body tense like someone stepping onto uncertain ground. "You look wonderful," my mother said, sitting down. "Success agrees with you." "Thank you," I said evenly. "How was your flight?" They spoke of delays, of weather, of nothing that mattered. The waiter came and went. My father glanced around the room, clearly uncomfortable with the luxury of it. Once that might have made me feel guilty. Now it only reminded me how much I had built without them. After the first course arrived, my mother folded her napkin and looked directly at me. "We've been following your company's success," she began. "Your feature in Forbes was quite impressive." "That's not how I remember things," I said quietly. "You told me computers weren't a real career." Her smile faltered just slightly. My father cleared his throat. "We may have misjudged the industry," he said, "but clearly you've done very well." "Yes," I said, "I have, without any support from my family." Silence hung between us, heavy as stone. Audrey shifted in her seat. Finally, my mother sighed. "Beatrice, we're not here to rehash old mistakes. We came because we need your help." She reached for my father's hand. "Your father's heart condition has worsened. The doctors recommend a specialized procedure, but insurance will only cover a fraction. We're running out of options." My father's eyes dropped to his plate. "Without the surgery, he said the prognosis isn't good." I looked at him, then really looked. His hands trembled faintly when he reached for his water glass. He wasn't the man who had once towered behind his desk, dismissing my dreams. He was smaller now, human in a way he had never allowed himself to be. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "How much is it?" My mother straightened. 250,000. I nodded. "And you've come to me. We wouldn't ask if it weren't serious," she said quickly. "Family should help family." The word family hit the air like a lie everyone agreed to ignore. I took a slow breath. "Before we talk about money," I said, reaching into my bag, "I want to address something else." I set a worn envelope on the table. The edges were frayed now, the USC letter inside still folded neatly. My mother's smile disappeared. My father went still. "You found it?" she whispered. "Yes," I said. "In a box you sent 4 years ago, along with 6 other acceptance letters you hid from me." Audrey looked from me to them, confusion and dawning horror in her eyes. "What is she talking about? You didn't know I asked." "Mom and Dad hid my college acceptances, including a full scholarship to USC, because they thought my success would hurt you." Audrey's face drained of color. "That can't be true," she said, turning toward them. "Tell me that's not true." Neither of them spoke. "Why?" Audrey asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you do that?" My father tried to speak first. "We had limited resources. We thought—" "You thought I didn't matter," I said quietly. "You let me believe I failed." My mother's voice cracked on its edge. "We never meant for it to hurt you this much. We just didn't think computers were a real future." I stared at her across the candlelight. "You didn't think I was a real future?" For a moment, no one spoke. The clinking of silverware from nearby tables sounded distant like another world. Finally, Audrey pushed her chair back slightly, shaking her head. "All those years, I thought she wasn't accepted anywhere." "You let me believe it." She looked at me, tears forming. "I'm sorry, Bea. I didn't know." Her apology landed softly, and for the first time that evening, something inside me eased. I turned back to my parents. "You didn't just steal an education from me. You stole the version of myself I could have become earlier. The confidence, the years, the belief that I belonged. And now you're here because you need me." My mother reached across the table. "We love you, Beatrice. We always have." "No," I said, calmly, pulling my hand away. "You loved the version of me that stayed small." The words settled in the space between us. My father's eyes glistened. My mother looked at the floor. I drew in a long breath and spoke slowly. "I'll pay for the surgery. Not for your sake, but because I don't want you to suffer. But there are conditions." They looked up, hope flickering. "First I said you'll tell the truth to the entire family. No more pretending I wasn't accepted anywhere. No more stories that make me the failure. Second, you will never ask me for financial help again. This is a one-time act of compassion, not reconciliation. And third, I need time and space to decide what kind of relationship, if any, I want with you moving forward." My father nodded, his voice rough. "That's fair." My mother's lips trembled, but she said nothing. The waiter returned with dessert menus, and we all declined. The evening ended quietly with half-hearted goodbyes that felt more like surrender than resolution. Audrey lingered as they stepped away. "I spent my whole life thinking you resented me," she said. "Now I realize we were both victims of their choices." "We were," I said gently. "But we don't have to stay that way." When she left, I remained seated for a long time. The candle had burned low, a thin wisp of smoke curling upward. Alex appeared from the bar and sat across from me. His presence was steady, unspoken comfort. "How did it go?" he asked. I looked down at the envelope still resting on the table, its corners darkened by touch. They wanted money, I said. I set boundaries. We reached something like peace, I suppose. He nodded. And you? I thought for a moment. Mostly, I just feel sad for the years lost for what could have been. But I also feel free. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. The city lights shimmered on the bay, quiet and constant. For the first time, I didn't feel small when I thought of my past. I just felt finished with it. Somewhere deep inside, I knew the next step wasn't revenge or reconciliation, it was release. And for me, that was enough. The city was still when I woke the next morning, wrapped in a gray light that softened everything it touched. The air from the bay carried a cool scent of salt and rain, the kind that makes even noise seem hushed. I stood by the window with a mug of coffee in my hand, watching fog drift low over the rooftops. For the first time in years, the silence felt clean. 2 weeks had passed since the dinner. I hadn't heard from my parents, though I knew they'd scheduled the surgery. I arranged everything directly through the hospital's billing office, transferring the payment quietly and requesting updates through the coordinator instead of them. It wasn't revenge. It was control, the kind I'd never been allowed before. The surgery went well. The report said recovery expected. I was relieved, but the relief came without tears. It felt more like closing a chapter than saving one. When the hospital confirmed payment, I walked along the Embarcadero to clear my head. The air was damp, the sidewalks slicked the bay, shining like liquid steel. Couples passed, holding hands, runners cut through the mist, and for a moment I felt small in a good way, part of the world again, not apart from it. My parents kept their word. A week later, I heard from my Aunt Caroline. She called to tell me they'd gathered the extended family for dinner and confessed what they'd done. How they had hidden my letters, how they'd let me believe I was unworthy. There were tears, she said softly. Your mother could barely get the words out. It was something to see her finally admit it. I thanked her, unsure of what to feel. Vindication and sadness moved together inside me, inseparable. When we hung up, I sat in the quiet for a long time. The truth was finally public, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like balance. The story had been set back where it belonged. Audrey began to write again soon after. Her messages were shorter now, lighter. She told me she was consolidating her loans and taking extra shifts at the hospital to pay them down. I need to stand on my own 2 feet, she wrote. It's about time I learned how. We talked every few weeks, not sisters as before, but as 2 women, meeting halfway after a long storm. There was no rush to rebuild, no promises of closeness, just small honesty exchanged carefully, like fragile glass. Once she sent a photo of the 2 of us from childhood, me at 7, her at 10, both in matching yellow raincoats on our porch steps. The image was blurred, the edges curled, but our smiles were genuine. Underneath, she had written, "Maybe someday we can take another one like it." On new steps. I didn't answer right away, but the picture found a place on my desk, beside a vase of wildflowers. Sometimes that was enough. Work filled the rest of my days. Next Level was expanding faster than I could have imagined. Danny handled most of the hiring, now building a team that felt more like community than company. Professor Marcus had joined our advisory board, and every time he stopped by, he'd shake his head with a half smile, saying, "You've built what college couldn't teach." I'd laugh, but the truth of it always settled deep. My loft had changed too. The walls that once held boxes of old regrets now carried paintings from local artists and photographs from friends. Alex had moved in, though we never made an announcement of it. His things simply began to appear, an extra mug on the counter, a sweater draped over the chair, the smell of cedar from his cologne clinging faintly to the hallway. The space felt warmer lived in. On quiet nights, he'd cook while I worked at the table, music low, the rhythm of normal life threading through the air like something sacred. One evening in late spring, he found me by the window, staring at the bay lights. "You've been quiet," he said, resting his hand on my shoulder. "I was just thinking about how far away Seattle feels now," I said. "It's strange how distance can heal what time couldn't." He smiled gently. "That's because you stopped waiting for them to fix it." He was right. The peace I'd found hadn't come from their apology or my success. It came from no longer needing either to define me. Somewhere along the line, I'd stopped trying to prove my worth and started living it. A month later, a small envelope arrived by mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside was a folded note from my father, short, almost hesitant. "Thank you for helping me live long enough to see my mistakes clearly. I won't ask for forgiveness, only the chance to do no further harm." There was no return address, no signature beyond his name. Just a small drawing at the bottom, two intersecting lines that never quite met but ran parallel. I stared at it for a long time before tucking it away in a drawer. Forgiveness wasn't a door I was ready to open, but I could acknowledge the knock. As the weeks turned into summer, I found myself waking earlier, drawn to the quiet hours before the city stirred. I'd walk to the park at the end of my street, coffee in hand, the air cool and full of jasmine. Sometimes I'd sit on the same bench every morning just to feel the world move around me. The joggers, the old man feeding pigeons, the children chasing each other across the grass. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing anything. I was simply there. Peace wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with triumph or applause. It came softly, like the sound of a page turning, like a door left open to let in fresh air. One afternoon, I hosted a small gathering for the company's 5-year anniversary. The office was filled with laughter music and the smell of catered food that never quite matched homemade meals. Danny clinked her glass for quiet and said, "To be who proved that vision and kindness can build something stronger than ambition alone." The room cheered. I smiled, letting their warmth wash over me, knowing these people, this life was the family I had chosen. Later that night, when the building emptied, I stayed behind. The city outside glowed gold and violet in the distance. I walked through the open workspace, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of desks, the whiteboard filled with ideas for what came next. There was no lingering anger anymore. Only gratitude for the teachers who saw me, the friends who stayed, and even the scars that taught me where not to return. I stepped onto the balcony, the air cool and sharp, with the scent of the sea. The sky above the bay was fading into dusk, the horizon a ribbon of light between two blues. Somewhere in that quiet, I felt the faintest echo of 17-year-old me, the girl who had once waited for a letter that never came. I wished I could reach back and tell her that every lost door had led here to this view, this breath, this peace. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need their absence to hurt. What I needed, what I finally had, was a life built from truth, bound by respect, and held together by love freely chosen. Some nights, I still think about that box, how it arrived like fate disguised as cardboard. I think of the moment the letter spilled across the floor, turning grief into clarity. That was the day my past stopped being a weight and became a story, one I could carry without shame. Now, when I look toward the future, it feels open wide and quiet in the best way. The kind of quiet that belongs to people who've earned their peace. If this story spoke to you, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever had to rebuild your peace after betrayal, share what helped you find your way back. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, second chances, and the families we choose for ourselves. Because sometimes peace isn't something we're given. It's something we decide to keep and guard with grace for the rest of our lives.